In the small, dusty town of Thunder Ridge, an old cowboy named Jake Quickdraw McCall was a fixture at the local diner, a quiet legend from another time. But when a group of young bikers, fresh from terrorizing towns and leaving a trail of corruption behind them, stop at the diner, they don't know who they're messing with. They mock Jake, unaware that he's still the fastest draw in the West. The moment they cross him, the criminal empire they've built will come crashing down, and Jake will show them exactly why some legends never die. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The clink of silverware on plates and the hum of quiet conversation filled the small, weathered diner in Thunder Ridge. The diner itself was a relic of a bygone era, a place where locals still gathered for their morning coffee and a warm meal, and where stories of the past hung heavy in the air. Above the counter, a sign that read, "Jake Special, Beef and Beans, $2," had been faded by years of sunlight, just like the man who was often seen sitting alone at a corner table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. His name was Jake McCall, but to everyone who had been around long enough to remember, he was Quickdraw McCall, a name earned long ago in a time when men like him were legends. Jake didn't speak much, but his presence was enough. He wore a weathered cowboy hat that shaded his face, his hair and beard streaked with gray, and his eyes were as sharp as ever, though the wrinkles around them told a different story. His hands were rough from a life of hard work and hard fights. Even in his old age, Jake could draw faster than most men half his age. And though the town had long since forgotten the wild days of his youth, Jake had never forgotten how to survive. Today, the diner was quieter than usual. The morning rush had died down, and the sound of the coffee pot being refilled was the only noise besides the occasional squeak of the door opening. Jake's eyes flicked to the window as a motorcycle roared into the parking lot. The engine revved loudly, too loudly for such a quiet town. A group of bikers stormed through the door, their boots thudding on the wooden floor with a heavy, confident rhythm. They were young, barely out of their 20s, and wore leather jackets adorned with patches from various towns and clubs. They didn't seem to care about the eyes that followed them as they walked in, their presence disrupting the peaceful routine of the diner. Jake's eyes barely flickered toward the newcomers, but the other patrons couldn't help but watch them. The bikers, all of them wearing scowls, walked to a table near the window and sat down with the swagger of men used to getting what they wanted. They didn't belong here, but they didn't care. The leader, a man with tattoos snaking up his neck and a piercing look in his eyes, slapped his hands down on the table as he sat. "Place smells like piss and old coffee," the biker spat, his voice thick with disdain as he looked around at the diner's humble interior. "This is what you get when you don't know how to run a town." The others laughed, a loud, mocking sound that carried across the diner. Jake didn't flinch. He was used to men like this. The town of Thunder Ridge had seen its share of trouble over the years, mostly from outsiders who thought they could roll in, take what they wanted, and leave without consequence. But Jake had lived through it all. He wasn't some young gun looking to prove himself anymore. The waitress, a woman in her 50s named Betty, approached the table with a forced smile, her hand shaking slightly as she set down the menus. She had seen this type before, and she wasn't interested in their trouble. But as she went to leave, the leader of the bikers stopped her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice a mockery of charm. "Bring us something that actually tastes like food, yeah? Not this canned garbage you serve." Betty's lips tightened, but she said nothing. She had learned over the years that some people weren't worth responding to. But the bikers weren't finished. The leader leaned back in his chair, looking over at Jake, still sitting alone at his table in the corner. "Well, look what we got here," he said with a laugh, his eyes narrowing as he studied the old cowboy. "Is that Jake McCall, the old man they say used to be the fastest draw in the West?" Jake didn't respond, still nursing his coffee, letting the biker's words hang in the air. The leader of the bikers stood up and swaggered over to Jake's table, his boots loud and deliberate against the floorboards. "Hey, old man, you still shoot those pistols, or you just come in here for a nap these days?" He was almost daring Jake to respond, to engage in their little game. Jake looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing, but his face still unreadable. The quiet calm of the room shifted just a bit, the hum of the diner replaced with the tension of an incoming storm. He set his mug down with deliberate slowness and finally spoke, his voice a deep drawl. "You're making a lot of noise for a man who doesn't know his place." The biker's face twisted in confusion and anger, and he scoffed, leaning in closer, invading Jake's space. "What? You think you're some kind of legend, old man? You think you can still draw on me?" Jake's eyes never wavered, but his hand never moved from the edge of the table. He didn't need to. The biker's bravado was thick, but it was obvious to anyone who had ever seen a real fight that he was used to intimidation, not real danger. "Let me guess," Jake continued, his voice steady. "You and your friends are used to pushing people around, taking what you want, huh?" The biker grinned, puffing out his chest, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. "Yeah, that's right. And what are you gonna do about it, old man?" Jake didn't blink. His hand moved with the smooth, practiced speed of a man who had drawn 1,000 times before. Before the biker even knew what was happening, Jake's gun was in his hand, aimed directly at the biker's chest. The room froze. The air was thick, heavy with disbelief. The biker's grin faltered, his eyes wide, his fingers twitching toward the empty holster at his side. "You sure you want to test that?" Jake asked, his voice quiet, but every word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. The bikers around the table fell into a stunned silence. None of them had expected this. They had mocked the old man, but they didn't realize the kind of man they were dealing with. Jake's reputation as Quickdraw wasn't just a story. It was a truth, and it was still as sharp as ever. And as he stared down the biker, the old cowboy's thoughts were clear. They had made a dangerous mistake. The diner was deathly quiet. Not a sound except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of a spoon against a coffee cup. The bikers, who had moments ago been loud and brash, now sat frozen, their eyes wide as they stared at Jake McCall. The gun in Jake's hand was steady, its cold barrel aimed at the chest of their leader, who stood rigid, his swagger evaporating into thin air. Jake's expression remained unchanged. He had lived through worse, fought battles, survived ambushes, and had stared down men who were far more dangerous than the group in front of him. In the old days, there hadn't been a man in the West who didn't know his name. Now, many of them had forgotten, but Jake hadn't lost his edge. Not by a long shot. The biker's leader slowly raised his hands, palms out, but his defiance was still evident in his clenched jaw. "Easy there, old man," he muttered, his voice shaky. "I wasn't serious. Just making fun, you know? You don't have to do something stupid." Jake's eyes never left him. "You're the one who walked over here with all that bravado, boy. You think I'm some old fool who can't hold his own? Or maybe you're just the one who's too stupid to know when to shut up." The leader flinched slightly at the words, but the sharpness in Jake's tone only made him more aggressive. "You don't scare me, old man," he said, trying to regain some measure of control, but the wobble in his voice was unmistakable. He glanced back at his group of bikers, trying to gauge whether they'd back him up. None of them moved. Jake didn't blink. "No one's scared of you," he replied calmly, lowering his gun just a fraction of an inch, enough to let them know they could breathe again. "You came in here looking to make noise. Now, you'll leave with a lesson in respect." The leader sneered, clearly still trying to salvage some pride. "Respect? What's that supposed to mean, huh? You some kind of hero?" Jake leaned back in his seat, still holding the gun with perfect ease, and regarded the biker with a quiet smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm no hero, but I know how to finish a fight. You and your crew are welcome to stay in this town as long as you remember who owns it. And you'll show some respect to the folks who've been here long before you ever decided to drag your bikes through town." The room held its breath, waiting for the biker to respond. His eyes darted to his crew, who still hadn't moved. A few of them were sweating now, the tension thick in the air. The leader could feel his heart pounding in his chest. They were no strangers to fights, but this was different. The old man wasn't backing down. In fact, he had already won. Jake's voice broke the silence, quiet and deliberate. "Here's how this is gonna go. You and your gang will apologize to the lady behind the counter for your little stunt. And then, you'll leave Thunder Ridge with your tails between your legs. You'll pack up your bikes and hit the road. And you'll never come back." There was a long, painful pause. The leader's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to press further. The way Jake was holding the gun, steady and unshaken, it told him everything he needed to know. He wasn't some old man with a shaky hand. This was a man who had fought, killed, and survived. He was quick with that draw, and more importantly, he was right. Jake McCall still commanded respect, and it was clear now that their bravado had only been a bluff. "All right," the leader muttered after a long pause, his voice filled with reluctant acceptance. "We're sorry, okay? We'll get out of your hair. Just don't do anything crazy, all right?" Jake nodded slowly, the gun never wavering. "Good decision." The leader motioned for the rest of his crew to stand up, his fingers still twitching nervously as they slowly complied. Each biker, one by one, stood, their faces pale, some avoiding Jake's unblinking stare. There was no more mockery in their eyes, no more cocky grins. They all knew they had just narrowly avoided something far worse. As they moved toward the door, the leader shot one last glare at Jake, but it was clear that he was beaten, defeated without ever firing a shot. Jake didn't say a word as they left, but he followed them with his eyes, making sure they knew this wasn't a town they could intimidate. Betty, the waitress, had stood quietly by the counter the entire time, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down the already spotless surface. She had seen her fair share of trouble in this diner, but nothing like this. She had been ready to call the sheriff, but now she realized there was no need. "Thanks," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she moved to Jake's table, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. Jake looked up at her, his face still unreadable, but there was a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "You're welcome, Betty," he replied simply, his voice as calm as ever. Betty smiled faintly and stepped back, still in awe of the old cowboy who had just turned the tables on a group of punks who thought they could run roughshod over this town. She had seen plenty of heroes come and go, but there was something different about Jake McCall. He wasn't a man who sought fame or glory. He was a man who'd been through hell and come out on top. And now, with just one calm gesture, he had reminded everyone in Thunder Ridge why they should never forget his name. The bikers filed out of the diner, their heads low, their shoulders slumped in defeat. They didn't know it yet, but their moment of arrogance had sealed their fate. Thunder Ridge wasn't just a sleepy town. It was a place where old legends still walked, and Jake McCall's draw was as fast as ever. Outside, the sound of their motorcycles revving to life was almost drowned out by the sound of the diner door closing. Thunder Ridge would go back to its quiet ways for a while, but things had changed. The balance of power had just shifted, and the bikers were already planning their next move. But they didn't know who they were up against. Jake McCall, Quickdraw to the end. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time the last of the bikers revved their engines and sped off into the night. Thunder Ridge was quiet again, the only sound the distant rumble of their bikes fading away. But the air in the diner still felt thick, heavy with the tension that had passed between Jake and the bikers. Inside, Betty wiped down the counter for the third time, her hands busy, but her mind racing. She hadn't seen Jake this calm in years, not since his days as a lawman. He had been the fastest draw in the West, back in the day, a man who could shoot a fly out of the air before it even knew what hit it. But that was a long time ago. The town had long since forgotten those days, and Jake had retired into the life of a quiet old man. But tonight, it was clear that the legend hadn't faded. Jake didn't say much as he finished his coffee. He just sat, staring into the mug like it held the answers to questions no one had asked. But Betty knew better than to push him. He'd speak when he was ready. That was just how Jake was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Jake set his cup down, his hand steady despite his age. He didn't look up at Betty, but his voice was low, like he was speaking to himself more than to her. "Those boys don't know what they've stirred up. They came in here thinking they could walk all over us. Thought they were going to turn this town into a playground for their violence." Betty stopped wiping, looking at him with concern. "What do you mean, Jake? Are you expecting more trouble?" Jake's eyes finally met hers. There was a flicker of something in them. Something fierce, something old. "They're not the problem. They're just the start." Betty swallowed, the weight of his words settling into her gut. She had lived in Thunder Ridge all her life. She knew the town's pulse, its rhythm, its heart. It had never been a place for big-time criminals. But the bikers, hell, she could feel it. There was something different about them, something dark and dangerous lurking behind their swagger. Jake's fingers drummed softly on the edge of the table, his thoughts clearly racing. That gang has been working its way through small towns, intimidating people, taking what they want. These are men who don't take no for an answer. And if they think they can take over Thunder Ridge, well, they've got another thing coming. Betty stood there, unsure of what to say. She had lived through hard times, had seen the town's struggles, but she had never seen anything like this. A gang coming in with the sole purpose of controlling the town. Sure, there had been scuffles and shootouts in the past, but the kind of fear that was growing now was something different. She could see it in the faces of the townspeople who had come in for breakfast that morning, the way they glanced at Jake after the bikers had left. They knew that Jake was still the man who could draw faster than anyone else, the man who had once cleaned up this town with a single hand. But what if it wasn't enough this time? What if this time, it wasn't just a fight of speed and skill, but one of survival? I'm going to have to deal with them, Betty, Jake said, his voice suddenly colder. And I don't intend to wait for them to make their move. I'll make mine first. Betty's hands tightened around the rag she was holding. Jake, what are you saying? You can't just go off, guns blazing. You're one man against a whole gang. You need a plan. Jake didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved toward the window, watching as the last of the bikers disappeared into the night, their taillights slowly fading from view. When he finally spoke again, his voice was firm, resolute. I don't need a plan, Betty. I've been a lawman long enough to know that when they come for your town, you don't wait. You don't sit back and hope for the best. You make them wish they had never crossed you. Betty's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew better than to argue with him. Jake had always been a man who did things his own way. But what worried her wasn't his ability to fight. It was the fact that he was alone. The town had changed. People had changed. And while Jake had the fastest draw in the West, the rules of the game had evolved. And the bikers, these men who had been terrorizing the small towns, had a different kind of power. Jake, Betty said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. What are you going to do? Jake stood up, his old bones creaking under the weight of years spent fighting. He walked toward the door, his hand brushing the worn hat resting on the coat rack. He turned to her, giving her a brief, almost wistful smile. I'm gonna remind him that this town belongs to the people who've been here long before they ever thought they could run it. And I'm gonna make sure they regret the day they thought they could walk all over us. Betty watched as Jake left the diner, the door creaking behind him. Her thoughts raced, the gravity of what he had said weighing heavily on her mind. She didn't want him to go after the bikers alone. She didn't want him to face that kind of danger. But she knew Jake. He didn't take orders. And he sure as hell wasn't going to let anyone threaten the town that he had protected for so long. As the diner door clicked shut behind him, Betty knew the fight had just begun. And this time, it wasn't just about Jake's Quickdraw. It was about something much bigger, the future of Thunder Ridge. The streets of Thunder Ridge were still as Jake McCall made his way to the edge of town. The setting sun cast long, sharp shadows, and the low hum of distant engines echoed in the air, the remnants of the bikers' departure still hanging over the town. The peaceful quiet of the evening felt fragile, like the calm before the storm. For Jake, it wasn't a time to relax or let his guard down. It was time to act. As he walked toward the old sheriff's office, his thoughts were clear. The town had been quiet for too long, and these bikers had come in with the intention of changing that. They didn't know who they were messing with, but Jake did. He knew exactly what they were capable of, and more importantly, he knew how to fight fire with fire. The office, like much of the town, had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the front porch creaked underfoot. But it was still standing, a relic from a time when Thunder Ridge had been a place where the law meant something. Jake had been that law, back when he was younger, faster, and the town had trusted him to keep the peace. Now, all these years later, he was the last one left who remembered those days. He was the last one who could still make a difference. He pulled the door open with a groan of rusted hinges and stepped inside. It was dark, dusty, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dried leather. The only light came from the faint glow of a lantern on the desk, flickering in the stillness. Jake moved to the back wall, where an old chest sat. It had been years since he'd opened it, but he knew what was inside. His old gear, his old revolvers. They were just as they had been all those years ago, polished and deadly. The weight of them felt familiar in his hands, like slipping into a second skin. His fingers brushed over the handles, and he took a deep breath, steadying himself. As his hand closed around the cold, worn grip of his favorite revolver, the memories flooded back, the gunfights, the showdowns, the times when the West had been his stage. He had been faster than anyone, his reputation echoing across every saloon and ranch, a name whispered in both fear and respect. Quickdraw McCall. It wasn't just a title, it was a warning. Now, standing in the sheriff's office, Jake knew what had to be done. Thunder Ridge had been too peaceful for too long. The bikers had tried to rattle the cage, and Jake wasn't going to let them get away with it. The town would either stand or fall, but it wouldn't be on the bikers' terms. He packed the revolvers carefully into his holsters, making sure everything was in place. He checked his ammo, his belt, his jacket. Everything had to be right. This wasn't a fight for the faint of heart. This was the kind of fight that could change everything. Jake looked out the window, his eyes scanning the empty streets. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension hanging thick in the air. The bikers were still out there, probably regrouping, planning their next move. They were cocky, arrogant, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Time to remind them, Jake muttered under his breath. He stepped out of the office and made his way to the stables where his horse, an old but loyal steed, waited for him. The horse nickered as he approached, and Jake gave it a gentle pat. It had been with him for years, through thick and thin. If he was going to face the bikers, he needed the speed, the sure footing. He needed every advantage. The sound of the horse's hooves on the dirt road was the only noise that cut through the night air as Jake rode toward the outskirts of town. He knew where the bikers had set up camp, just on the other side of the river, near the abandoned warehouse. It was the perfect spot for them, isolated, out of sight. But Jake knew better. He'd been tracking men like these for a long time, and he knew exactly how they thought. The sound of his horse's hooves pounding on the dirt was drowned out by the distant roar of engines. Jake's lips tightened, and he urged his horse into a faster gallop. His eyes never wavered from the path ahead. He didn't need to rush. The bikers were already at a disadvantage. They didn't know it yet, but the tables were about to turn. As Jake approached the river, he slowed his horse and dismounted. He moved silently, his boots crunching softly on the ground. He could hear the bikers now, laughing, joking, like they owned the place. They didn't even have a clue that someone had been watching them. They were about to find out. He crept up to the edge of the old warehouse, crouching behind a stack of crates. The sight of the bikers was enough to make his blood run cold, but not with fear, with something else. The anger, the frustration that had been building up since they had walked into Thunder Ridge. They were just another band of outlaws who thought they could take whatever they wanted. Jake wasn't going to let them. He waited for the right moment, watching as the bikers idly passed around bottles of whiskey, laughing and carrying on. They thought they had it all figured out. But there was one thing they didn't know. Jake McCall was still the fastest draw in the West. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of the river and dust. Jake's fingers twitched at his side, itching for the feel of his revolvers. He was ready. The bikers didn't even know he was there yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they realized they had made a fatal mistake. The first biker stepped forward, tipping his bottle back and laughing loudly. That's when Jake moved. In one swift motion, he drew both revolvers, the sound of the hammers clicking back filling the air. Before the biker could even turn around, Jake fired twice, his shots landing true. The first biker dropped, his hands flying up in surprise. But it was too late. The rest of the bikers froze. Their hands went to their guns, but Jake was already one step ahead. He was faster than they had ever imagined. The first shot rang out like a clap of thunder, loud enough to send the group of bikers stumbling back in shock. The bullet hit its target square in the chest, and the biker fell to the ground with a grunt, his eyes wide with disbelief. The others froze, their hands still hovering near their holsters, eyes darting between Jake and their fallen comrade. But it was too late. The old cowboy had already made his move. Jake's second shot followed almost immediately, his left hand steady, the revolver's roar still hanging in the air. The second biker dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled backward, blood quickly soaking his jacket. The remaining bikers, caught in the shock of what had just happened, didn't even think to draw their weapons. They had seen something they hadn't expected. A man, old but still deadly, out of place in the world they thought they ruled. They weren't in control anymore. Jake McCall was. The fear started to creep in, but Jake didn't give them time to rethink their plans. He moved quickly, his boots scraping against the dirt as he advanced on them, his revolver still smoking in his hands. "Drop your weapons," Jake said, his voice calm, but his tone carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. "I don't want to make this a bigger mess than it needs to be." The leader of the gang, the one who had been so cocky only a few minutes ago, was the first to recover. He reached for his holster with shaky hands, his fingers fumbling as he tried to draw his own gun. But Jake was faster. Before the biker could even clear his holster, Jake's gun was already aimed at him. "You're not in charge here," Jake said softly, his eyes locked on the bikers. "You never were." The leader's hand faltered, his whole body trembling with fear now. His crew was watching, but none of them moved to help. They were too scared to do anything but stand there, frozen in place. "Let's make this simple," Jake continued, his voice cold and steady. "You can walk away and never come back, or I can show you why they used to call me Quickdraw." The leader, now pale and sweating, dropped his weapon to the ground with a thud. One by one, the rest of the bikers followed suit, their eyes never leaving Jake, their minds racing with fear and confusion. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. They had come here to make a statement, to take control. But now they were the ones who had been reduced to nothing more than frightened children. "Now, get on your bikes," Jake ordered, his voice sharp as a whip, "and get the hell out of Thunder Ridge." One of the bikers, a young man with a sneer still on his face, started to speak. But Jake's eyes flashed dangerously, and the man immediately shut his mouth. He didn't need to be told twice. They all got moving, picking up their bikes and kicking them to life one by one, each of them eager to get away from the man who had reminded them exactly who the boss of this town was. Jake watched them go, his hand never leaving his gun, his eyes hard. As the last of the bikers roared off into the night, he finally holstered his revolvers and took a deep breath. The adrenaline still buzzed in his veins, but the job was done. For now, as he turned to leave, he could hear the sound of footsteps behind him, the shuffle of boots on the dirt. Betty was standing there, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She hadn't seen him fight like that in years. Not since the old days when Jake had been the lawman of Thunder Ridge. Back then, no one had dared mess with the town, not when Jake was around. But now? "Well, I'd say that's one way to handle things," Betty said, her voice a little shaky, but with a note of admiration. Jake smiled softly, the lines of age creasing his face as he looked at her. "Just reminding them of a few old lessons." Betty shook her head, still in awe. "You really are quick. I thought for sure they'd take you down this time. But you—" She trailed off, unsure of what else to say. Jake nodded, though his eyes were distant. "I didn't come here to get taken down, Betty. Not by them or anyone else. This town belongs to the people who fought for it. I'm not about to let some punks with leather jackets come in here and wreck everything." Betty stepped forward, her hands still shaking slightly, and she put a hand on his arm. "You saved us, Jake. You saved Thunder Ridge. But there's more to come, isn't there?" Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, the weight of her words hitting him square in the chest. "More's always coming," he replied grimly. "There's a lot of people out there looking to take what they can, and they don't stop just because you win one fight." Betty didn't say anything, but she could see the truth in his eyes. Thunder Ridge had always been a small town, quiet and out of the way, but now it had a target on its back. The bikers were just one group, but there would be more. There always were. Jake looked over his shoulder at the empty road, the dust still settling from the bikers' departure. He didn't know when the next challenge would come, but he knew one thing for sure. When it did, he'd be ready. Let's just hope I don't have to show them again why I earned the title Quickdraw, Jake muttered, more to himself than to Betty. Back at the diner, the rest of the town was beginning to come to life. People started to trickle back from their homes, drawn out by the sound of the engines and the gunshots. The stories would spread quickly. Jake McCall, still the fastest draw in the West. They would talk about it in hushed whispers, in the safety of their homes. But the truth was, they'd all just seen a legend come back to life. Betty looked at Jake as he prepared to leave, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't a man who needed to be thanked. He had done his part, and he would do it again, if he had to. As Jake stepped out of the diner, Betty looked after him. There was something different in the air now. Jake McCall had saved Thunder Ridge, and as long as he was here, no one would ever forget it. The moon hung high over Thunder Ridge, its pale light illuminating the quiet streets as the sound of Jake McCall's boots echoed in the stillness. His old horse was tethered to a post outside the sheriff's office, but Jake didn't need to ride. His thoughts were already racing, and he knew that whatever had happened tonight was only a small part of the bigger picture. The bikers might have left, but their influence had already spread, like a disease that had begun to fester in the corners of the town. Jake knew the battle had been won, but the war was still far from over. He'd faced many enemies in his time. Outlaws, bandits, men who wanted to claim Thunder Ridge as their own. But these bikers were different. They weren't just after a fight. They had come with a purpose, to bend the town to their will, to bring it under their control. They weren't just trying to steal a few dollars or rob the local bank. They wanted something deeper, something that could change the fabric of this place forever. Jake couldn't let that happen. As he walked down the dark street, his mind raced with plans. He'd fought for Thunder Ridge when it was just a small, quiet town, and he'd fought for it when it was full of danger and violence. But now, it felt like it had something to prove. It had to prove that it wasn't just a pit stop for criminals to roll through. It had to prove that it belonged to the people who had built it, who had lived through the worst and still managed to survive. He stepped up onto the porch of the old sheriff's office and took a seat, leaning back in the creaky chair. His eyes scanned the horizon, the wind rustling the dry grass in the distance. The night was still, but Jake knew that wouldn't last. The town's uneasy peace had already been shattered, and there were more troublemakers on the way. He had to get ahead of them before it was too late. The door of the diner opened behind him, and Betty stepped out, her face tense as she approached. "You've been sitting here all night," she said, her voice cautious. "Are you planning to tell me what's going on? Or are you just going to keep to yourself?" Jake looked up at her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You've been around long enough, Betty. You know how it goes. We win a fight, but that's just one round." Betty crossed her arms, concern in her eyes. "Jake, you can't keep doing this. You've got a town to look after, and you can't fight every battle alone." Jake's eyes softened for a moment, but he didn't respond. He knew Betty was right. Thunder Ridge was full of people who depended on him, who still remembered the days when the law had meant something, when Jake McCall had been the one to bring justice to the Wild West. But those days were gone. The town had changed, and he had too. "They don't know who they're dealing with, Betty," Jake said finally, his voice quieter now. "They think they can come in here, take over, and leave without a mark. But I'm not going to let that happen. Thunder Ridge might be small, but it's mine, and I'm not letting anyone walk all over it." Betty nodded slowly, understanding. "I know you can handle them, Jake, but the town's different now. The bikers won't be the last of it. The longer this goes on, the harder it'll be to keep everyone safe." Jake glanced at her, his eyes hard. "I've been doing this long enough to know that safety's a luxury. We make our own luck out here. And if I have to fight every last one of them to keep Thunder Ridge standing, I will." Betty didn't say anything for a moment. She knew Jake had seen enough bloodshed in his time to last a lifetime. She also knew he wasn't the same man he'd been in his prime. But the fire inside him was still there. He was still a force to be reckoned with, even if his body didn't move as quickly as it used to. And that was why she trusted him. "I'm not going anywhere, Jake," she said softly, a determined look on her face. "But you're going to need more than just your gun this time. The whole town's going to have to stand together." Jake stood, pushing his chair back with a slow scrape. He didn't need to look at Betty to know she was right. The days of handling things alone were over. He couldn't keep doing this by himself. If Thunder Ridge was going to survive, the town needed to pull together, not just in the face of danger, but for the future. "You're right," Jake said, his voice firm. "I've been fighting my own battles for too long. But this time, we do it together. The whole damn town." Betty's expression softened, and she stepped closer. "You'll get them to listen." "You always do." Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. There was work to do. He had a town to save. The following morning, Thunder Ridge was alive with the usual hum of the daily routine. Farmers heading out to the fields, merchants setting up their stands, and children running along the dirt roads, laughing and playing. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air now. People were whispering, talking about the bikers who had come into town the night before, and wondering if they'd be back. Jake had already spent the morning organizing his plan. He was going to need help, more than just the few loyal men he could rely on. He would need the townsfolk, the ones who remembered what it meant to stand their ground, the ones who understood that Thunder Ridge wasn't just a place to pass through. It was home. By midday, Jake had gathered a group of the town's most trusted, from ranchers to shopkeepers, all of them willing to stand by him. They gathered in the town square, their faces filled with determination, but with a hint of fear too. No one had asked for this fight, but it had come, and they had to face it. Jake stood in front of them, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't need to say much. They all knew why they were there. "They think we're weak," Jake said, his voice carrying across the square. "But this town has never been weak. It's always been strong because we've always stood together. We've been through worse, and we'll get through this. But we need every one of you. No one can do this alone." There was a murmur of agreement, a quiet nodding of heads. They might have been unsure at first, but now, with Jake McCall leading them, they were ready. They knew they had to stand together, or they would lose everything. "We fight," Jake continued, "not just for ourselves, but for everyone in this town. And we start by making it clear that no one, gets to take Thunder Ridge from us." The crowd's resolve hardened. This was more than just a fight. This was about reclaiming their home. Jake looked at the faces before him, feeling the weight of what had to come next. "Let's show them who we are." Thunder Ridge had always been a quiet town, one of those places where time seemed to stand still. The people here knew each other, worked together, and shared a sense of community that could only exist in places untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But now, the peace was under threat. The bikers, those outlaws who had come with violence in their hearts, had thrown the first punch, and Jake McCall, the man who had spent his life keeping the peace, was ready to throw the next. Jake stood in the center of the town square, the sun shining down on him as he looked out at the people who had gathered. A mix of ranchers, shopkeepers, and old-timers filled the crowd, their faces a mix of uncertainty and determination. They had come together quickly, just as Jake had asked. They had been through hardships before, but this was different. The bikers weren't just passing through. They were here to take control, and Jake wasn't going to let that happen. "All right," Jake said, his voice low but commanding. "We've got one shot at this. We do it right, and we make sure they know Thunder Ridge isn't a place for their kind." He paused for a moment, letting the words settle in. The town had never been this close to the edge, but there was something about Jake's presence that made them believe they could fight back. "We don't have much time," Jake continued. "They're gonna be back soon. But we're not just gonna wait for them to come to us. We're gonna take the fight to them." The crowd murmured, unsure but willing to follow the man they had known for so long. Betty, standing off to the side, watched Jake carefully. She could see the weight on his shoulders, the years of battles fought reflected in his eyes. He wasn't just leading a town. He was leading his past, his experience, and his history. And they were following him because they had no other choice. "I've seen the kind of men these bikers are," Jake said, his eyes scanning the crowd, settling on a few of the men he trusted. "They think they can bully this town, scare us into submission, but they don't know what we're made of. This town has survived worse than them." He turned toward the outskirts of town, where the abandoned warehouse sat on the edge of the river. It was where the bikers had set up camp the night before. Jake had been there earlier, scouting the area, figuring out how he was going to handle them. "Here's the plan," Jake said, his voice firm. We hit them hard and fast, take them by surprise. We know where they're set up, so we'll split into two groups. One will come from the north, the other from the south. We'll surround them. No one gets left behind. And when they see that Thunder Ridge isn't theirs to take, they'll think twice before coming back." The townsfolk exchanged nervous glances, but there was a quiet sense of resolve building. This wasn't the life they had signed up for. They were farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, but they had something the bikers didn't: home. And Jake had reminded them that home was worth fighting for. Jake's eyes met Betty's, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. She didn't need to say it. Jake knew she was worried, but she also knew that there was no turning back now. They were in this together. "Now, let's get moving," Jake said, breaking the silence. "We've got a fight to win." The two groups moved swiftly and quietly, their footsteps light but purposeful. Jake led the southern group, his old boots silent on the dirt as he made his way toward the bikers' camp. He was leading them into a fight that could determine the future of Thunder Ridge. There was no room for mistakes, no room for hesitation. As they neared the camp, Jake's senses were alert. He could feel the heat of the moment, the adrenaline starting to build in his veins. The bikers had set up camp in the old warehouse, the perfect place to hide out and plan their next move. But it wasn't just a hiding spot anymore. It was about to become the site of their downfall. Jake motioned for his group to spread out, positioning them in the shadows, keeping a low profile. They had the element of surprise, but they had to move fast. One wrong move, one loud noise, and the whole plan could be ruined. But Jake knew what he was doing. He had done this 1,000 times before. He looked at the men around him. Some of them young, some of them older, but all of them willing to fight. They were scared, but they were ready. They knew that if they didn't take a stand now, they would never have the chance again. This wasn't just a fight for their homes. It was a fight for their future. "On my mark," Jake whispered, his voice low but clear. "Stay close. Don't let them see you coming." The sound of the river rushing nearby was the only noise that filled the air as they waited, crouched in the tall grass. Jake's fingers tightened around his revolver, the cold steel comforting in his grip. The wind shifted slightly, and he took a deep breath, the moment finally here. His eyes flicked to the other group to the north. He could see them moving into position as well. Everything was set. They just needed to wait for the right moment. And then, without warning, Jake's hand shot up. It was time. "Now!" he shouted. The two groups surged forward, moving with the precision of men who had done this before. Jake's revolver was already drawn as he moved toward the warehouse, his boots pounding the dirt as he led the charge. The bikers, caught off guard, scrambled to reach for their weapons. But they were too slow. Jake's first shot rang out, striking one of the bikers in the leg before he could even raise his gun. The rest of the bikers tried to fight back, but it was too late. Jake and his group were already on top of them, closing in from all sides. The air was thick with the sounds of gunshots and shouts, but Jake was focused, moving quickly, firing with precision. He didn't hesitate, didn't give the bikers a chance to retaliate. One by one, they fell, their weapons useless against the speed and precision of Jake McCall's draw. Within minutes, the camp was overrun. The bikers, disoriented and outmatched, began to retreat. But Jake didn't stop. He followed them, driving them out of Thunder Ridge with each step. As the last biker fled into the night, Jake stood in the middle of the camp, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. He had done it. Thunder Ridge was safe, at least for now. The bikers had been sent running, and their criminal empire had been brought to its knees. He holstered his revolver and turned back toward the town, his eyes scanning the horizon. This wasn't over. The fight had been won, but Jake knew there would be more battles to come. The West was never quiet for long, but tonight, Thunder Ridge was his. The dust still hung in the air like a cloud, remnants of the battle Jake had just led. The last of the bikers had retreated, their engines fading into the distance, their pride shattered in the wake of a fight they thought they could control. But Jake McCall had reminded them what happens when you mess with a town that's been fought for, and more importantly, a man who had fought for it all his life. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the stillness as Jake made his way back toward Thunder Ridge. His revolvers were already holstered, but his hand still rested on the butt of his gun, a habit that was hard to break. The adrenaline hadn't quite worn off, and his senses were sharp, alert. Even though the fight had been won, the danger hadn't passed. Not yet. He reached the edge of the town, where the others were already gathering. They had done their part, pushed the bikers back, shown them what Thunder Ridge was made of. But Jake wasn't fooled by their victory. He had seen too many times how quickly a town's peace could turn to chaos. There would be others, people looking to take what was theirs. And they would come for Thunder Ridge, just like the bikers had. Betty was the first to approach him as he made his way back to the diner. Her expression was a mixture of relief and concern, her eyes scanning him for any sign of injury. There was blood on his coat, but it was mostly from the bikers, not him. "You did it," Betty said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "You got rid of them." Jake gave a grim nod, looking over his shoulder at the smoke rising from the riverbank, where the bikers had made their last stand. "For now," he said, his voice rough. "But don't get too comfortable. This is just the start." Betty's face tightened, but she said nothing. She had seen enough to know what Jake meant. This wasn't a town that would be left in peace for long. There was too much money to be made in the West, too many people looking to take advantage of small towns like Thunder Ridge. The bikers were just the first wave. Jake stepped into the diner, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The place was still, save for a few townsfolk sitting at the counter, their eyes flicking toward Jake as he entered. There was a quiet respect in their gazes now. Respect for the man who had brought the fight to the bikers and sent them running. Jake didn't sit. Instead, he walked to the back, where a few of the more trusted townsmen had gathered. They had seen the violence, had heard the gunshots, but they weren't sure what to do next. Jake didn't need to explain. They all understood the weight of the moment. "We won tonight," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "But this town doesn't stay standing on its own. The bikers won't be the last of it. The next group that comes will have more men, more guns, more power." The men around him nodded in understanding, their faces hardening with the gravity of Jake's words. They had already seen what Jake could do, had witnessed his speed and his precision. But that wasn't enough anymore. Not if they were going to keep the town safe. "We need to be ready," Jake continued. "And we can't fight this alone. We need every able-bodied person in Thunder Ridge to step up. I don't care if you're a rancher or a shopkeeper. If you're here, you're part of this fight." There was a moment of silence, and then one of the older ranchers, a man named Bill, spoke up. "What's the plan, Jake? How do we stop them from coming back?" Jake's eyes flicked toward the window, the sun now beginning to sink lower on the horizon. The town was quiet for now, but the tension was palpable. He knew the answer, but it wasn't one that would be easy to accept. "We fight back, but we do it smart. We take the fight to them before they have a chance to organize. We don't wait for them to come to us. We make sure they know Thunder Ridge isn't a place they can roll through and terrorize." Bill frowned, looking at Jake with a mix of respect and concern. "You're talking about more than just a fight, Jake. You're talking about making this town a target. There's gotta be another way." Jake shook his head slowly. "We can't hide from them, Bill. Hiding is what they want. They want us to cower in fear, to let them run this place. And we can't let that happen. Thunder Ridge belongs to us. We take a stand now, or we lose it forever." There was a long pause as the weight of Jake's words settled over the room. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke up. They knew that Jake was right. They had seen what happened when people let their guard down, when they thought they could hide from the world. The West didn't let you do that. One by one, the men stood, their faces set in grim determination. "All right, Jake," Bill said finally, his voice steady. "We're with you." Jake nodded, his expression hardening. "Good. Now we need to prepare. We've got a few days before they regroup. We use that time to get our people ready. We start training, get our defenses in place. No one in this town sleeps easy until we know the job is done." Betty stepped into the room, her face softening as she saw the determined looks on the men's faces. "What can I do to help?" she asked quietly, looking at Jake. Jake glanced at her, his eyes softening just for a moment before returning to the task at hand. "Keep the townsfolk calm, Betty. Make sure they know we're handling this. The last thing we need is panic." She nodded, her face set. I'll do that. But Jake, she paused, looking at him with concern. You don't have to carry all of this on your own. We're all in this together. Jake met her gaze, the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him. He had always been the one to protect Thunder Ridge, to make sure it stood strong. But now, as the town rallied behind him, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. We'll get through this, he said, his voice firm. Together. As the town prepared for what was to come, Jake McCall knew this would be the fight of his life. But he also knew that Thunder Ridge wasn't just his town. It was the people's town, and they weren't going to let anyone take it from them. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the streets of Thunder Ridge as the people began to mobilize. Jake McCall's plan was simple but necessary. Get the town ready for whatever came next. There was no time to waste. The bikers had already shown what they were capable of, and it was clear now that this wasn't just about intimidation. It was about control, and Jake wasn't about to let them take what they thought was theirs. As the townspeople gathered in the town square, the atmosphere was tense. The sounds of boots moving across dusty streets, men whispering in hushed tones, women gathering supplies, filled the air. There was no panic, no fear. Just a quiet, resolute energy as everyone prepared for the unknown. The town had faced many challenges, but this felt different. This wasn't just another wild card to deal with. It was a fight for the future of Thunder Ridge. Jake stood at the front of the group, his back straight, his face weathered but strong. His hand rested on his holster, and his eyes scanned the crowd. He could see the doubt in a few faces, men and women who had never been in a fight like this, who had never held a gun or been forced to make life or death decisions. But Jake didn't need to tell them to be brave. They already were. They had followed him this far, and they were ready to follow him all the way. All right, Jake said, his voice loud enough for the group to hear. We've got one shot at this. We can't afford to wait for them to come back. We move out tonight. There were murmurs in the crowd, some unsure, others more confident. But Jake's words carried weight. This wasn't just about their safety anymore. It was about showing the bikers, and anyone else who might come for them, that Thunder Ridge would not be bullied. We'll split into two groups, Jake continued. One group will head north, and the other will flank from the south. We know their camp is up by the old warehouse. I've seen it myself. They're dug in, but they're not expecting us to come at them tonight. We'll have the advantage. A rancher named Clint, one of the more seasoned men in town, stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. How do we know they won't be waiting for us? He asked, his voice steady, but with the concern of a man who had seen his share of gunfights. What if they have more men hiding out? Jake nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. They might, Clint. But that's why we have to move fast. We hit them hard, catch them off guard, and take their control of this town away. We don't give them time to regroup. Once they're on the run, they'll be too scattered to fight back effectively. Betty moved up beside Jake, her presence comforting yet filled with determination. She had seen the same doubt in some of the faces of the townspeople, but she was ready. She had no other choice. You've got this, Jake, she said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. We all do. Jake looked at her for a moment, his gaze softening. He had fought battles, faced down danger, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for everyone in this town, for the future of Thunder Ridge, and that was something worth protecting. We all do, Jake replied, his voice low but filled with conviction. Now, we move out. And remember, we're fighting for more than just a place to live. We're fighting for our home. The townspeople, their faces now filled with resolve, broke into groups. The plan was simple. The northbound group would cut through the narrow pass by the riverbank, while the southern group would take the long, dusty road that ran along the edge of the canyon. The bikers didn't know it yet, but they had made a grave mistake by underestimating the people of Thunder Ridge. Jake walked toward the stable, where his old horse stood waiting, restless, its mane blowing in the breeze. The horse had always been a companion, but tonight it felt like more. His link to the past, to everything he had fought for. He saddled the horse, his movements steady, the familiar weight of his gear a comfort as he slipped his revolvers into their holsters. As he mounted the horse and looked back at the town, He saw the people preparing for what was coming. They were ready, and so was he. "We move out in 30 minutes, Jake called to the group, his voice firm and final. "Get yourselves ready." The townsfolk scattered to their positions, each person knowing their role, each man and woman taking their place in a battle that would determine the future of the town they called home. Jake rode toward the northern group, who were already gathering near the river's edge. They had all made the decision to fight, to stand up for something that was theirs. As the sky began to darken, Jake's thoughts were sharp. The bikers had been the first, but they wouldn't be the last. The West was a place where violence was a currency, where blood was spilled to take land, control, and power. But Thunder Ridge was different. It wasn't just land. It wasn't just about the money. This was about the people who had built it from the ground up, who had kept it alive when everything else around them had fallen apart. And Jake McCall wasn't going to let it fall now. The first sign that the bikers were ready for a fight came just as the two groups were closing in on their camp. The night was nearly silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. But Jake could feel the tension building in the air, the sense that something was about to give. One of the men from the southern group, a young rancher named Sam, raised his hand, signaling that they had spotted the bikers. The camp was illuminated by a small fire, the shadows of the bikers flickering against the warehouse wall. They hadn't seen the townsfolk yet, but Jake knew that wouldn't last long. He gave the signal. "We move out," Jake said, his voice steady. "We don't give them time to think. Stay sharp." The two groups surged forward, a coordinated attack meant to overwhelm the bikers with sheer numbers and speed. As they neared the camp, Jake's hand tightened on his revolver. He knew this wasn't just about taking the camp. It was about taking back control. Jake McCall wasn't just quick on the draw. He was quick in everything he did. The first gunshot cracked through the night like a thunderclap. And then, the world erupted. The first gunshot rang out, sharp and unmistakable, tearing through the quiet night like a crack of lightning. The air was instantly charged with the tension of the battle, the hum of adrenaline buzzing in every ear. Jake's revolver was already drawn, his body moving with the fluidity of a man who had lived through countless skirmishes, the rhythm of his movements etched into his very bones. The town's fighters surged forward from both the north and south, closing in on the biker camp. The bikers, caught off guard by the sudden assault, scrambled in panic, trying to organize themselves. But Jake McCall had already taken control of the situation. The element of surprise was theirs. The fight was on their terms. Jake's first shot was a warning. It wasn't aimed at a man, but instead at a barrel near the campfire. The explosion of sparks and the thud of the barrel rolling away sent the bikers scrambling in all directions. The confusion worked in their favor, giving the townspeople a moment to close in. From the north, Clint, a grizzled rancher with decades of experience, fired his rifle, his shot landing with a resounding crack. One of the bikers, who had been attempting to unsling his rifle, went down instantly. The rest of the bikers had barely enough time to react before the townsfolk surged into the camp, pushing them back, forcing them into the corners of the warehouse. Jake rode in, his horse moving smoothly through the chaos, his revolver flashing in the dim light. He could see the leader of the biker gang scrambling, looking for cover, but Jake had already anticipated his move. With a quick, practiced motion, he fired twice, and the leader dropped, his body hitting the dirt with a sickening thud. The rest of the bikers froze for just a moment, eyes wide with the realization that their leader was down, but then the chaos of the fight engulfed them. They began firing wildly, their shots erratic, but the townsfolk were already closing in. Jake's group was prepared, more than prepared. They knew how to handle themselves in a fight, and they weren't about to let this bunch of punks take the upper hand. The first biker to draw on Jake was already too slow. The cowboy's revolver was already pointed at him, the shot echoing in the night before the biker had even pulled the trigger. The man dropped to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. Jake moved with purpose, taking each step with the calm precision of someone who had been through this many times before. The townsfolk had their orders, and they were executing them with deadly efficiency. No one was hesitating, no one was backing down. This was their town, and the bikers were not welcome here. Through the haze of gunfire and dust, Jake's eyes locked onto a figure in the back of the camp, a biker with his back to the wall, trying desperately to reload his rifle. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved forward, his revolver raised, the cold barrel pointing directly at the man. One shot, and the biker went down. The rest of the bikers, realizing that the fight was already lost, began to retreat, scrambling for their motorcycles, trying to flee into the night. But the townsfolk weren't going to let them get away that easily. Clint and the others had already positioned themselves, cutting off their escape routes, keeping them from running. "Don't let them get away," Jake shouted, his voice rising above the sound of gunfire. "They won't stop unless we stop them now." The last few bikers, too frightened to fight back, dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Jake's eyes scanned the battlefield, taking in the sight of the bikers, broken and defeated, surrounded by the people of Thunder Ridge. There was no more fight in them. They had been overwhelmed, outnumbered, and outmatched. Jake approached the last of the bikers, the man who had tried to make a run for it on his motorcycle. He was kneeling in the dirt, his face covered in sweat, his hands shaking. Jake stopped a few feet in front of him, the barrel of his revolver still aimed at his chest. "You've got two choices, friend," Jake said, his voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge. "You can leave and never come back, or you can stay, and I'll make sure you never forget why you shouldn't have crossed Thunder Ridge." The biker looked up at him, fear written across his face, but his pride was still there, flickering in his eyes. He swallowed hard and, with a shaking hand, reached for his jacket pocket, pulling out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. "I'll leave," he muttered, his voice rough, but his pride still unbroken. "Just don't shoot me." Jake lowered his gun slightly, but his eyes never left the biker. "Smart choice." The townsfolk began to gather around, looking at Jake with a mixture of awe and relief. The fight had been short, brutal, and decisive, but it was over. The bikers had been routed, their gangs scattered. They had learned the hard way that Thunder Ridge wasn't a town to be taken lightly. Betty stepped forward, a relieved but tired look on her face. She hadn't been part of the fight, but she had seen it all unfold from the edges of the battlefield. The town had proven that they could stand together, that they could fight and win. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. The bikers had been sent packing for now, but Jake wasn't fooling himself into thinking it was over. Jake holstered his revolver and walked over to Betty. "We've won the battle, but we've got more ahead of us." Betty nodded, a tired smile tugging at her lips. "But tonight, Thunder Ridge took back what was ours." Jake looked at the others, the men and women who had stood beside him, fought with him, and kept their town safe. There was pride in their eyes, but also a quiet understanding that the fight wasn't over. There would always be others who would try to take control, but as long as Jake McCall and the people of Thunder Ridge stood together, they wouldn't be taken down. He turned back toward the camp, where the last of the bikers had been taken into custody. He didn't need to say anything more. They all understood. Thunder Ridge was theirs to protect. For now, it was quiet again, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. But when the next storm came, Thunder Ridge would stand its ground once more. Thunder Ridge was quiet again, the dust still settling on the streets as the last remnants of the bikers' presence disappeared. The camp was gone, the bodies of the fallen laid out in the center of the town square, their weapons discarded and their pride shattered. But Jake McCall knew better than to let his guard down. This moment of victory was hard-earned, but it was fleeting. The West had a way of testing a man's resolve, testing the resolve of an entire town, and Jake knew it wasn't over. Not yet. As the townspeople slowly filtered back to their homes, Jake stood at the edge of the square, his eyes scanning the horizon. The fire of the fight still burned in his veins, but there was something else now, something quieter. A weight had been lifted, but the lingering fear of what could come next still hovered in the air. Betty stepped up beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. They both knew what this victory meant. But there was no time to rest on their laurels. Jake's mind was already moving, calculating the next steps, planning for the eventual return of those who had been driven out. There were always others. "You did it," Betty said softly, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "You saved the town." Jake didn't look at her right away. Instead, he focused on the town square, the the silence now broken only by the faint sounds of the breeze rustling the leaves in the trees. "We saved it," he corrected her, his voice rough. "And don't fool yourself into thinking this fight is over. This was just the first round. They'll be back. They always come back." Betty's brow furrowed, but she said nothing. She had seen Jake in action, seen him pull the trigger with unflinching precision. She had seen the resolve in his eyes, the quiet power he exuded when he was ready for battle. But even Betty could feel the weight of what Jake was saying. It wasn't just the bikers. They weren't the only threat in the West. There were always more men like them, always more who wanted to control what didn't belong to them. Jake turned toward her then, his face hard and determined. "We need to make sure the town knows it can't relax. This place belongs to the people who've fought for it, who've bled for it. It doesn't belong to anyone who thinks they can waltz in and take it." Betty nodded, understanding exactly what Jake meant. She had spent years running the diner, taking care of the town's needs, but even she knew the truth. Thunder Ridge had always been a quiet town, tucked away in the dusty reaches of the West, too far out of the way for the bigger criminals to bother with. But now, the town had been marked. The bikers had set their sights on it, and there would be others who followed their lead. "We'll help you keep it," she said quietly, her voice steady. "We won't let anyone take it from us." Jake gave her a small, approving nod. "That's what I needed to hear. We're all in this together. But we can't just wait for them to come back. We need to send a message. We need to show them that Thunder Ridge stands strong." The days after the fight passed quickly, and the town of Thunder Ridge went back to its usual rhythm. But underneath the normalcy, a sense of unease lingered. People were more cautious, more aware of the dangers that could be lurking in the shadows. The town had won the fight, but everyone knew the battle wasn't over. Jake spent the following days gathering the town's most trusted men and women, preparing for the possibility that the bikers, or others like them, might return. They had to be ready, and Jake was the man to make sure they were. He knew how to fight, how to lead. But this time it wasn't just about speed and precision. It was about strategy. The West wasn't kind to men who didn't plan ahead. The first order of business was to fortify the town, reinforce the edges, set up watch posts, and make sure everyone knew their place in the event of another attack. The streets were quieter now, but that didn't mean they were safe. The enemy had seen Thunder Ridge's strength, and they would be back. They always came back. Jake stood in the town square again, looking over the buildings, the land. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Thunder Ridge wasn't just his town. It was everyone's. He had spent years protecting it, but now, more than ever, he realized that the future of Thunder Ridge rested on the shoulders of its people. "Jake," Clint's voice called out from behind him. Jake turned to see Clint walking toward him, a grim look on his face. "What's the word?" Jake asked, his voice steady. Clint hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We've had some word from the neighboring towns. They've heard about the bikers, and some of them are interested in coming here, helping us. They've been dealing with similar problems in their own towns." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. "How do we know they're not just looking to take control themselves?" Clint shook his head. "I don't know, Jake, but we can't afford to turn anyone away. We need all the help we can get. And the townsfolk are worried. They want to make sure this place stays safe." Jake nodded slowly, weighing the decision. He didn't trust outsiders easily, not in the way Clint did, but there were too many unknowns, too many dangers, to be alone in this fight. He wasn't willing to turn anyone away unless he knew they were a threat. And right now, all he knew was that Thunder Ridge was still standing, just barely. "All right," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's meet with them. But if they have any funny business, they'll be out faster than they came." Clint nodded. "I'll make the arrangements. We'll meet them by the river tomorrow." Jake looked out at the horizon once more, his thoughts turning inward. He had lived this life for a long time, fighting, surviving, protecting, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just about keeping the town safe. This was about ensuring its future. And in the West, nothing was certain. The fight was far from over. But Jake McCall wasn't finished yet. The sun was just beginning to rise over Thunder Ridge when Jake McCall rode out to meet the newcomers. The morning air was crisp, the dust still hanging in the streets from the previous night's chaos. He could feel the tension building once more, like the quiet before a storm. His instincts told him to be cautious. This town had been through enough already, and now Jake was preparing to face a new challenge. The arrival of outsiders who claimed they wanted to help. Clint had gone ahead to the riverbank to meet the other townsfolk, to make sure they weren't walking into something that might endanger them all. Jake didn't trust anyone who didn't understand the delicate balance of survival in the West. Trust was earned, and he wasn't about to let anyone walk into Thunder Ridge thinking they could take advantage of the situation. The meeting spot was a small clearing by the river, a few miles outside of town. The river itself was a narrow, winding stream, cutting through the landscape, a natural boundary that separated Thunder Ridge from the untamed wilds. It was a peaceful place, but today it felt anything but. Jake knew this was a pivotal moment, one that could either secure Thunder Ridge's future or destroy it. As he approached the riverbank, Jake could already see Clint standing by a small group of riders, their horses tethered nearby. The riders were a mixed lot, some wearing the dusty clothes of ranchers, others dressed more like soldiers. The leader was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, his eyes hard and calculating. His hands rested on the pommel of his saddle, his posture rigid, like someone who had spent his life in command. Jake stopped a few feet away, his horse's hooves barely making a sound on the dirt. He studied the leader for a moment, sizing him up. The man didn't flinch, didn't seem to mind the scrutiny. Jake liked that. In this line of work, a man's composure spoke volumes. "You the one they call McCall?" the leader asked, his voice deep and rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. Jake nodded slowly, his hand resting casually on his revolver. "I'm Jake. You the one who's been making waves in the neighboring towns?" The man chuckled, a low, amused sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Making waves? We've been helping out where we can. Some of the towns around here have been getting restless. Word is, you've got a bit of a problem with some bikers. Thought we could lend a hand." Jake studied the man for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The words sounded good, too good. Almost. Helping out? Lend a hand? It was always easier to ask for help than to give it, and Jake wasn't in the habit of relying on strangers. But the truth was, Thunder Ridge needed every bit of help it could get, and Jake wasn't foolish enough to think he could fight every battle alone. "What's the catch?" Jake asked bluntly. He didn't have time for games. The man's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "No catch, McCall. We just want to make sure the people of Thunder Ridge have the support they need. We've dealt with these bikers before. We know how they work. And if you want my honest opinion, I think you're going to need more than a few old men with quick draws to keep them from coming back." Jake didn't flinch. The man was right, of course. The bikers weren't just the first wave. They were the beginning of something bigger. But Jake had spent his whole life defending Thunder Ridge. He wasn't about to hand over control to someone else, not without knowing who they were and what they wanted. "We'll handle the bikers," Jake said, his voice steady. "But I'll let you stick around if you're here to help, not to take over." The leader looked at Jake for a long moment, a small flicker of something passing across his face, something that could have been amusement, or perhaps understanding. He nodded once, sharply. "Fair enough," he said. "But you need to understand something, McCall. You can't protect this town by yourself. We've got the numbers, the experience. We're offering you a chance to make sure this doesn't happen again. If you're too proud to accept help, then you can fight your battles alone. But we've seen this before. People like the bikers, they don't stop." Jake's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything right away. He understood. He knew better than anyone that pride had a way of blinding a man. But this wasn't just about pride. This was about keeping Thunder Ridge intact. And if that meant working with these outsiders for now, Jake would do it. "You can stay," Jake said, his voice low, but firm. "But this town is still mine. If you plan on sticking around, you follow my lead." The leader studied him for a moment, and then, with a stiff nod, extended his hand. "Agreed." Jake didn't shake it immediately. Instead, he looked down at the man's hand, then back at his face. He wasn't sure if this was the right move, but Jake McCall had never been afraid to take a risk when it came to protecting the people he cared about. He extended his hand, gripping the man's firmly. "All right," Jake said. "We'll work together. For now." Back in town, word of the new alliance spread quickly. The people of Thunder Ridge had mixed feelings about the outsiders, but they trusted Jake, and if he said they were on the level, they were willing to give them a chance. The newcomers wasted no time setting up camp on the outskirts of town, their horses tethered to the trees, and their supplies organized. They had the look of a group used to moving fast, used to fighting wars. The townsfolk, however, weren't sure what to make of them. They had seen enough of Jake McCall's battles to know that he wasn't the type to work with strangers, but there was something different about this time. The threat wasn't just a gang of bikers. It was something bigger. By nightfall, Jake and the leader of the new group, a man named Tom, stood at the edge of the river again, looking out over the still water. "They'll be back," Jake muttered, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Tom didn't respond at first, just watching the water with a quiet intensity. Then he spoke, his voice low. "We'll make sure of that, McCall." The air between them crackled with the weight of their unspoken agreement. They had their differences, but they shared the same goal. Thunder Ridge had to be protected, and Jake McCall wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. But as they stood together, staring out into the night, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this uneasy alliance, this fragile cooperation, might be the calm before an even bigger storm. The days that followed were filled with preparations. Jake McCall and the group of newcomers worked together to fortify Thunder Ridge. The town was small, but its people were strong, and with the additional help from Tom's group, the town now had more numbers, more firepower, and more experience than ever before. But Jake knew it wouldn't be enough if the bikers, or anyone else, decided to come back with force. The West had a way of breaking the strongest men, and it was no different for a town like Thunder Ridge. As the days stretched on, the townspeople began to settle into a routine. The merchants restocked their shelves, the ranchers and farmers went about their business, and the women took up arms, learning to defend their homes. Jake didn't just teach them how to shoot. He taught them to think, how to survive, how to fight when there was no other choice. But Jake didn't get much sleep. Each night, after everyone had gone home, he would take a walk around the town, checking the perimeter, looking for weaknesses. He knew better than to assume they were safe. And he knew, in his gut, that it wasn't just the bikers they needed to worry about. Whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes, whoever had set the bikers on their trail, was still out there. They hadn't given up. Not yet. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door of his small cabin at the edge of town. It was late, too late for a casual visit. He stood from his desk, where he had been scrawling notes on the bikers' movements and strategizing possible scenarios. His hand brushed the revolver at his side as he opened the door. It was Clint, his face tight with concern. "Jake," Clint said in a low voice, glancing around before stepping inside. "We've got word. One of the scouts spotted something up north." Movement. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant. They had been waiting for this, waiting for a sign that the bikers or someone else were making their next move. Jake wasn't the type to sit back and wait. Not anymore. "How many?" Jake asked, already moving toward the table to grab his gear. Clint shook his head. "We're not sure, but it's enough to make me worried. A few of the men think it's just scouts, but others, they think it's something bigger." Jake didn't waste time with further questions. He grabbed his revolvers and strapped them to his belt. "Get the others. We're going up there to find out what's going on." "I'm not waiting for them to make their move." Clint nodded. "I'll round up a few men. We'll meet you at the south end of the town." Jake grabbed his hat from the hook by the door and walked out into the night. The air was cold, the stars faint in the cloudy sky. The town was still, too still. He could feel the weight of the moment settling on him. It was as if the calm before the storm had taken on a life of its own, and the quiet was only the prelude to something much worse. The group met by the southern edge of town, just past the dried creek bed, where the land flattened out and stretched toward the open desert. The cold wind bit at their faces, but Jake didn't flinch. His mind was already racing through the possibilities. "You know the drill," Jake said to Clint and the others. "We move fast. If we find them, we take them by surprise. If it's more bikers, we're taking them out. No questions. No mercy." The men nodded, their faces set with determination. These were good men. Men who had seen violence before and weren't afraid of it. They knew Jake. They knew his reputation, and they trusted him. "Let's move out," Jake ordered. The group set out under the cover of darkness, their footsteps light on the hard ground. They moved as a unit, silent and swift, heading toward the northern edge of the town where the scout had reported the movement. The closer they got, the more Jake's senses went on high alert. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver, his eyes scanning the horizon. Something was wrong. As they neared the location, they spotted the first sign of trouble. A small fire, barely visible against the dark sky. The flickering glow was enough to confirm that someone was out there, and they were getting close. Jake motioned for the group to spread out and move quietly toward the fire. They crept through the scrub, every muscle tensed, ready for anything. The closer they got, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a small group of scouts. It was something bigger. There were at least a dozen men gathered around the fire, their backs to the approaching group. Jake's heart rate picked up, but his movements remained calm and controlled. This was it, the moment of truth. He signaled for Clint and the others to take their positions, and without a word, they spread out in a semicircle, closing in on the unsuspecting group. The air seemed to hold its breath as the men crouched low, waiting for Jake's signal. On 3, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. 1, 2, 3. Without hesitation, Jake sprang into action, his revolvers drawn in an instant. The gunfire rang out, echoing in the night like a thunderclap. The men around the fire scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but it was too late. Jake's first shot hit the nearest man square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The others were caught off guard, but Jake was already on them, his revolvers flashing in the dim light. The townsmen didn't hesitate. They fought with the precision of men who had been trained by Jake himself, swift, efficient, ruthless. The attackers were outnumbered and outclassed, and it didn't take long before the last man fell to the ground, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. Jake surveyed the scene, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the fight. There were no more bikers, no more threats, at least not tonight. But Jake knew that the battle was far from over. As he holstered his revolvers, Clint approached, his face tense. "Who were they, Jake?" Jake glanced down at the bodies, his eyes scanning the remains. There was something about these men that didn't sit right with him. Not bikers. These men were too organized, too well trained. Whoever sent them is planning something bigger. Clint nodded, his face grim. "You think they'll be back?" Jake looked up at the dark horizon, his eyes narrowing. "They never leave. And when they come back, we'll be ready." Jake McCall had just won another fight. But in his gut, he knew this was only the beginning. The night was quiet again, but the air seemed thick with the weight of unspoken words. Jake McCall stood at the edge of the camp, his boots planted firmly in the dust as he surveyed the aftermath of the brief but brutal skirmish. The bodies of the attackers lay scattered around the fire, their weapons discarded, their lives extinguished by the speed of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to survive in the unforgiving West. Jake was still as fast as ever, but tonight, the feeling in his gut told him that the fight wasn't over. Clint approached, his boots heavy on the ground. The others were already securing the area, making sure no one else had been left to ambush them. But Jake's mind was already on the bigger picture. "What do we do with the bodies?" Clint asked, his voice low and steady. "We'll bury him," Jake replied, his tone firm but not without weariness. "But don't expect a simple answer. These men weren't just wanderers. They were part of something bigger, Clint. And if we let this go without digging deeper, it'll cost us more than we've got." Clint's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You think it's the bikers, don't you?" Jake shook his head slowly, his gaze locked on the bodies. "These aren't bikers. They were organized, coordinated. This feels like something else, something bigger. And I don't know who's pulling the strings, but I'm damn sure we haven't seen the last of it." Clint exhaled sharply, looking back toward the town, where the faint glow of the lights from the buildings still flickered in the distance. "We can't keep doing this. Not forever. The town can only take so much." Jake's eyes remained steady. "I know, but Thunder Ridge isn't just any town, and it won't fall as long as we're breathing. These men, and whoever sent them, don't know who they're dealing with. Thunder Ridge belongs to the people who fought for it, and we're not going to let anyone take it from us." Clint nodded, his gaze hardening. "I'll spread the word. We'll prepare, just like you said. Everyone needs to know what's coming." Jake finally turned away from the camp, his eyes scanning the men who had fought beside him. The townspeople had already rallied together, already proving they weren't just passive bystanders. They had the grit, the determination. But even with that, Jake knew it wasn't enough. This wasn't just a fight for their homes. It was a fight for survival. And Thunder Ridge was sitting in the crosshairs of something far bigger than any of them could imagine. By the time Jake and Clint made it back to Thunder Ridge, the town was still awake, but the air was thick with unease. Word had spread quickly, and the people were talking in hushed voices about the fight, about the dead men in the dirt. Some were scared, unsure of what would come next. Others were angry, more determined than ever to keep their homes safe. Jake could feel the shift in the air as he rode into town, the tension rising with every step. The fight had been won, but Jake knew the war was far from over. As the townsfolk gathered, murmuring amongst themselves, he dismounted his horse and moved toward the center of the square, where the group of men and women who had fought with him were waiting. Clint arrived just behind him, walking toward the front of the group. "We've got work to do," Clint said loudly, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But tonight, we've got something more important to do first. We need to remind the people of this town that we fight together. No one's standing alone here." Jake stepped forward, his eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk. They were all different, ranchers, shopkeepers, families, but tonight, they all shared the same thing. The knowledge that Thunder Ridge's survival depended on them. No one was going to protect it, but the people who called it home. "Listen up," Jake said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, sharp and steady. "The bikers have made their move, but they're not the only threat we'll face. They've got their eyes on Thunder Ridge. But we've got something they don't, each other." The crowd went quiet, their eyes locked on Jake. He could see the fear in some of their faces, the uncertainty. But there was something else there, too. Determination. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of men and women who had fought with him before. It was the look of people who had something to protect, and they weren't going to let it go without a fight. "We don't know what's coming," Jake continued, his voice rising with authority. "But we know one thing. We won't let it take us down. We'll fight for this town, for each other. And when they come for us, whoever they are, we'll be ready." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was filled with a shared understanding. The townsfolk weren't just bystanders anymore. They were soldiers in a war that they hadn't asked for, but now they were part of. The people of Thunder Ridge had always been tough, but Jake had just reminded them of their strength. Clint stepped forward and looked at the group. "We'll organize into shifts, watch the perimeter, set up defenses, make sure everyone knows what's at stake. We've got to stay alert, and we've got to stay smart. The next attack won't come the same way as the last." The crowd nodded, their faces set, their minds focused. Jake could feel the change in the air. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about survival. Thunder Ridge had proven that it could fight back, but now the real battle would begin. It was a battle for everything they had fought for. Their homes, their families, their way of life. And no one was going to take it from them. As the townsfolk scattered to prepare for the coming days, Jake turned back toward the horizon, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were more enemies to face, more challenges to overcome. But tonight, Thunder Ridge had made one thing clear. It wouldn't go down without a fight. And Jake McCall was the man who would make sure they fought for it, no matter the cost. The days dragged on, but the tension in Thunder Ridge only seemed to intensify. The air, thick with the uncertainty of what lay ahead, felt oppressive as the townspeople settled into a grim routine. Watch shifts were set up, weapons were sharpened, and every day the men and women of the town practiced, trained, and prepared themselves for the next attack. Jake McCall had seen wars, bloodshed, and the worst that men could do to each other. But this wasn't a war that had been declared. This was a war that had been thrust upon them. And as the days stretched on, Jake could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The new group, led by Tom, had settled in on the outskirts of Thunder Ridge. Jake still didn't trust them completely. There was something about the way they moved, the way they spoke, that made him feel uneasy. But the truth was, they were helping. And Thunder Ridge needed help. They were building defenses, making sure the town could stand firm when the storm finally came. It wasn't just the bikers anymore. It was something bigger. Jake had seen the way they'd operated, coordinated, organized, with a purpose. And that meant one thing. This wasn't just a gang. This was an army of outlaws, working together, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Jake stood at the edge of town that morning, his eyes scanning the horizon. The wind was calm today, but his mind was anything but. He could feel it, like a whisper at the back of his mind. Something was coming. He had lived long enough to know the signs of a coming storm. The birds weren't singing anymore. The horses were restless, and the town was too quiet. He turned to Clint, who had been walking up behind him, a quiet look of determination on his face. Clint had been with Jake through every fight, every battle, and Jake trusted him like he trusted no one else. But even Clint's usual confidence seemed shaken. "Something's off today," Clint said, his voice low. "I can feel it, Jake." "The air's too still." Jake nodded, but his face remained calm. He wasn't one to give in to superstition or fear. "I know. I feel it too. But we've prepared. We've done what we can. Whatever comes, we're ready." Clint glanced over at the town, where people were still going about their business, unaware of the growing unease. "You really think they'll come today?" Jake didn't answer right away. His mind was racing through every possible scenario. The bikers might wait. They might regroup and come back with more men. But there was something else in the air. Something that told Jake that today was going to be different. "I don't know," Jake said finally, his voice quieter now. "But we're not going to sit around and wait for them to make their move. We move first. We make sure they know that Thunder Ridge isn't their town." Clint gave a short nod. "I'll round up the men. We'll be ready." As Clint moved off to gather the rest of the town's fighters, Jake felt a deep, gnawing sense of foreboding. It wasn't just about the bikers anymore. The gang had made its play, but Jake knew there was something bigger lurking beneath the surface. The way the bikers had organized, the way they had moved through the surrounding towns, it was too calculated, too precise. Jake walked back toward the center of town, where Betty stood by the diner, her face tight with concern. She was the one who had kept everything running smoothly, the one who had kept the town's heart beating when the world around them had gone dark. And even now, with everything that had happened, she was still the anchor that kept them all grounded. "What do you think is coming?" she asked, her voice steady but full of the same quiet worry Jake could feel in his bones. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice low. "But whatever it is, we're ready. And we'll make sure they know Thunder Ridge is ours." Betty stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I trust you, Jake. I just hope this doesn't cost us more than we can handle." Jake looked at her, his eyes steady, unwavering. He had fought for this town for years, but now it felt like it was all coming to a head. He wasn't just protecting Thunder Ridge anymore. He was protecting the people in it, the families that depended on the land, the homes that had been built from blood, sweat, and hard work. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. "We'll win," Jake said, his voice certain. "We've got the advantage. And as long as I'm breathing, no one's taking this town from us." The evening rolled in, and the town was on high alert. The groups were positioned at strategic points, watching the roads, keeping an eye on the horizon. The men and women of Thunder Ridge had grown used to the tension, but tonight, it felt different. Tonight, there was a quiet expectation in the air. Everyone was ready. Jake stood on the edge of town once more, the sun dipping behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the land. His mind was still racing, and he felt every second of the waiting like a tightening noose. The night was calm, eerily calm, and he knew that whatever came next would change everything. It wasn't until the first sound of distant engines reached his ears that Jake felt his muscles tense. The unmistakable roar of motorcycles echoed through the valley, growing louder with every passing second. This wasn't just a few bikes. This was an army. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he turned toward the group of townsfolk positioned at the south side of the town. "They're coming," Jake shouted, his voice carrying across the square. "Get into position. No mistakes." The engines grew louder, closer. The bikers had made their move. But Jake wasn't surprised. He had known they would come. The only question now was how they would fight back. "They think they can take us," Jake muttered to himself, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "But they haven't seen what Thunder Ridge is made of." As the bikes thundered toward the town, Jake and the people of Thunder Ridge braced themselves for the battle that would determine their future. The storm had arrived, and Thunder Ridge was ready to weather it. The night air was thick with the hum of approaching engines, the sound growing louder with each passing moment. Jake McCall's heart beat steady, but his mind was racing, processing every detail. The bikers were coming in force, but he wasn't about to let them take Thunder Ridge. He had prepared for this. He had led his town through battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for land. This was a fight for their very survival. Jake stood with the townspeople, the sense of unity among them palpable. They had trained, they had fought together, and now they were ready to stand together against whatever came next. But even as he stood there, his hand resting on his revolver, a quiet, unsettling feeling lingered. There was something about this attack that felt like more than just another band of outlaws. The bikers had changed. They were organized now, coordinated. And Jake knew that the gang they were facing had more than just a few guns. They had a plan. As the first of the bikers appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes illuminated by the dim glow of the moon, Jake's instincts kicked in. His hand flexed on the grip of his revolver, and he quickly scanned the positions of the other townsfolk, each of them in their spots, ready for action. "They're almost here," Clint called from behind him, his voice low but filled with determination. Clint had been Jake's right-hand man for years, and tonight was no different. He had spent his life on horseback, his rifle never far from his side. But even Clint couldn't shake the unease that hung over them. These weren't the same bikers they had fought before. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the others, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. The townsfolk, men, women, and children, had gathered together at the center of the town, forming a tight, well-organized group. Jake had spent days preparing them for this moment, teaching them how to hold their ground. He wasn't going to let their courage falter now. "Remember," Jake said, his voice calm but firm, "stay focused. Don't let them get too close. We need to keep them off balance. Make sure they know they can't win this fight." A few of the women and younger men nodded, their faces determined. Betty, standing beside Jake, gave him a small but reassuring nod. She had seen more than enough of the violence in the West, and she was ready to fight just as hard as any man in the town. As the first biker rode into town, kicking up dust in his wake, Jake's eyes locked onto the approaching figure. The man's leather jacket glinted in the moonlight, and the sound of his engine rattled the still air. He slowed as he neared, but his eyes darted nervously from side to side as if unsure of what to expect. Jake stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dirt as he moved toward the biker. The other townsfolk remained still, watching intently, their eyes fixed on Jake as he made his way to the middle of the road. "You lost, friend?" Jake called, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. The biker didn't answer immediately, his gaze flicking from Jake to the rest of the group that had emerged from the shadows. He hadn't expected the town to be so organized. "Not lost," the biker finally replied, his voice rough. "Just here for what's ours." Jake took another step forward, his revolver still holstered, but his hand ready. "This town doesn't belong to you. It never has." The biker grinned, but there was no real amusement in it. "You think you can stop us? You think you can take on all of us?" Jake didn't answer. Instead, he waited. The air was thick with tension, the sound of the engines now drowned out by the growing silence in the town. Jake's senses were on high alert. He could feel the weight of every man and woman watching, waiting for the first move to be made. The biker shifted on his motorcycle, clearly trying to size up Jake. But Jake wasn't going to give him that opportunity. Without warning, the biker revved his engine, and Jake's hand shot to his revolver. The townspeople were already moving, but it was too late to avoid the first shot. The biker fired, the bullet whizzing past Jake's ear and sending a cloud of dust into the air. The fight had begun. Jake's revolver was already drawn by the time the biker made his move. In one swift motion, he fired, the sound of his gun echoing through the town. The bullet hit the biker square in the shoulder, knocking him off balance and sending him sprawling onto the ground. His bike tipped over with a screeching noise, but the man was already pulling himself up, clutching his arm. "Take cover," Jake shouted to the others, his voice cutting through the chaos. The townspeople scattered, finding shelter behind buildings and crates, their own weapons drawn. The second biker was already moving, his bike roaring to life as he aimed his rifle at Jake. But before he could fire, Clint's shot rang out, taking the man's rifle from his hands and sending him tumbling backward off his bike. Jake didn't waste a second. He moved forward, his revolver still in hand, his eyes fixed on the bikers who were now regrouping. It was a short, brutal firefight. The townsfolk, trained and focused, held their ground. The bikers, unprepared for the organized resistance they had encountered, were forced to retreat quickly. But even as the first few bikers fell back, the rest were already making their way toward the south side of town. "Don't let them get away," Jake shouted, his voice rising above the sound of gunfire. Clint and a few others pursued the retreating bikers, but Jake stayed behind, his eyes scanning the battlefield. He knew there was more to this than just a few bikers on a rampage. These men weren't acting alone. Someone was pulling the strings. But who? The last of the bikers disappeared into the night, and the dust settled. Jake's chest heaved as he holstered his revolver, taking in the aftermath. The town was safe, for now, but the damage had been done. Thunder Ridge had been marked. Clint returned, his face grim. "We've got a few wounded, but we held him off. They won't be back tonight." Jake nodded, but his mind was already racing. The bikers might be gone, but Jake knew they wouldn't stay gone for long. There was someone else behind this, someone who had orchestrated the attack. And whoever it was, Jake McCall was going to find them. "We'll be ready," Jake said, his voice low. But this isn't over. The people of Thunder Ridge stood together, a quiet but resolute strength in their eyes. The battle had been won, but the war was still out there. Jake knew that better than anyone, and when the next storm came, Thunder Ridge would stand ready to face it head-on. The silence that followed the battle hung heavy over Thunder Ridge. The adrenaline from the fight still buzzed in Jake McCall's veins, but the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. The bikers had retreated, for now, but the feeling in Jake's gut told him that this was only a temporary setback. Whoever was behind this, their real enemy, was still out there, and they were watching. Jake stood at the edge of town, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first light of dawn was creeping over the hills. The dust from the battle still lingered in the air, and the faint sounds of people moving around in the background reminded him that the town had survived another fight. But it wasn't over. It couldn't be. Clint approached, his face tense, a few others following behind him. Jake didn't have to look at them to know they were thinking the same thing. This wasn't just another gang of outlaws. It was something bigger. They'd seen the way the bikers had worked together, the way they had been organized. This wasn't random chaos. It was calculated. "Jake," Clint said, his voice low, "we've got a few men patched up, but we need to figure out what the hell is really going on here." This wasn't just an attack for territory. These men knew what they were doing. Jake nodded, his jaw set tight. "I've been thinking the same thing. This isn't just some group of riders looking to make trouble. They came with a purpose, and someone's pulling the strings." The townspeople gathered around the square, the men and women who had fought and defended their homes. Some were tending to the wounded, others were cleaning up the mess left by the battle. But despite the physical toll, the people of Thunder Ridge stood strong. They had faced danger before, but this time felt different. The fight was more than just a matter of survival. It was a matter of standing up for what they had built, and that made it personal. "We need answers," Jake said, turning to Clint and the others. "Whoever sent these bikers wants something, and if we don't find out what that is, they'll be back. And next time, they won't stop." Clint frowned. "But we don't have enough information. We don't know who they're working for, or what they want. For all we know, they could be just another group looking to take control of this area." Jake shook his head, his thoughts sharp. "I don't think it's that simple. These men came in with tactics. They knew the terrain. They knew the layout of the town. They're not just after resources. They're after control." Jake looked out at the distant hills again. His eyes narrowed. And I think I know where they're coming from. Clint raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I've been tracking them, Jake said quietly. Not just these bikers, but anyone who's been moving through the area. There's something about the way they've been operating. A few of the towns have been targeted, but none of them are talking. But I've got a hunch. Someone's been using the chaos to push their own agenda. Clint's face hardened. You think they've been setting this up for a while? Jake nodded. I think this is bigger than just a biker gang. I think there's a network behind it. We need to find out who's in charge of that network, and fast. Where do we start? Clint asked, his voice steady. Jake turned back toward the group, his eyes scanning the townsfolk, his mind already racing with plans. We're going to make sure no one leaves town until we figure this out. Everyone's got a part to play. We need to track any outsiders, anyone who might have information. But we also need to keep an eye out for anyone who's been acting strange. People who might have been watching us, waiting for their moment. Clint nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. We'll handle it. You get to the town's edges. Check out the areas the bikers might have come from. There might be something we missed. Jake looked out over Thunder Ridge again, the quiet town that had become his life. He had fought for it, bled for it, and he would die for it if necessary. But he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. Not now. I'll handle it, Jake said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. But don't expect this to be over anytime soon. Whoever's behind this is just getting started, and we need to stay ahead of them. The hours that followed were filled with quiet but intense activity. Jake and the townsfolk worked together, tightening the defenses, securing the perimeter. There was no time to rest, no time for doubt. Thunder Ridge had been marked, and now it was a target. Jake could feel the weight of every decision, every move. It wasn't just the bikers anymore. They were part of something bigger, and Jake wasn't about to let them get away with it. By mid-afternoon, Jake had made his way to the north side of town, to the area where the bikers had made their initial approach. The ground was still scarred with the evidence of their movements, tracks, broken branches, and the remnants of discarded gear. Jake crouched down, examining the area closely. There were things here, small details that had been overlooked during the chaos of the fight. A scrap of cloth, torn and faded, caught his attention. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the rough fabric, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. The symbol stitched into the cloth wasn't one he recognized. It was a small insignia, a mark that had been burned into his memory from years ago. A symbol used by a group of outlaws that Jake had crossed paths with long ago. They were ruthless, merciless, and they had been operating just outside Thunder Ridge for months, quietly pulling strings. Jake's gut clenched. This wasn't just about bikers. This was about organized crime. A network that had been slowly infiltrating the area, gaining power, waiting for the right moment to strike. With the symbol still clutched tightly in his hand, Jake made his way back to town. His thoughts were focused on one thing. The battle was just beginning. As night fell over Thunder Ridge, Jake stood once more at the edge of town, the symbol in his hand. His mind was racing as the quiet town settled into uneasy rest. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for control, and Jake McCall was going to make sure Thunder Ridge stayed his. Thunder Ridge was quiet once more, but the peace felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice waiting to crack. Jake McCall stood at the edge of town, the symbol from the bikers' camp still clutched tightly in his hand. He had seen that insignia before. It was the mark of a ruthless group of outlaws known as the Ghost Riders, a criminal network that had been operating in the region for years. They were known for their violent methods, their ability to blend into the shadows, and their tendency to strike when a town was weakest. Jake had crossed paths with them once, a long time ago, and the memories were still fresh in his mind. The Ghost Riders didn't just want to take control of land, they wanted power, and they wouldn't stop until they had it. The bikers were just pawns in a larger game, a game that Jake wasn't about to let play out on his watch. He glanced back toward the town square, where Clint and the other men were still organizing. The townspeople had done everything they could to prepare, but Jake knew that preparation wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just another gang looking to raid a town. This was a full-fledged assault, and if Jake didn't act quickly, Thunder Ridge would be swallowed whole. Clint walked up to him, his face set in grim determination. "You find anything?" he asked, his voice low, filled with the kind of concern Jake knew all too well. Jake didn't answer immediately. He stood for a moment, staring at the symbol in his hand, his mind racing. The Ghost Riders had been quiet for years, lying in wait, but now, it seemed, they had found their moment to strike. Jake couldn't afford to waste time. The longer he waited, the more ground the Ghost Riders gained. These men, they're part of something bigger, Jake finally said, his voice quiet but firm. I've seen this symbol before. It's from a group called the Ghost Riders. They're no ordinary outlaws. They're a network, Clint. A damn powerful one. Clint's expression hardened. I've heard the stories. They've got connections all over the West. But I didn't think they'd come this close. They're here now, Jake replied, his eyes narrowing. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. We need to get ahead of them. We need to take the fight to them before they're able to organize fully. Clint nodded. All right, what's the plan? We've got to find out who's behind them, Jake said. The bikers are just the beginning. The Ghost Riders are using them to scout out the region. We need to find their hideout, their base of operations, and we need to hit them hard. If we wait for them to come to us, we'll be sitting ducks. Clint took a deep breath. You think we can find them? The Ghost Riders are good at disappearing. They don't leave much behind. I've been tracking them for years, Jake said, his voice steady. I know how they work. They're not ghosts, Clint. They leave a trail. We just have to know where to look. Clint glanced toward the others, who were still preparing the defenses. All right, Jake. You lead the way. We'll be right behind you. Jake nodded, already making his way toward the town's outskirts. Gather a few of the men. We're heading out tonight. That night, Jake and a small group of townsfolk set out, moving silently through the dark, away from the safety of Thunder Ridge. They had only a few hours before the Ghost Riders would be expecting reinforcements, and Jake couldn't afford to waste time. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the land as they made their way into the hills. The area was familiar to Jake. He had spent many years hunting down outlaws in these hills, tracking them through the wild, learning their habits. But tonight, the hills felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that told Jake they weren't just hunting bikers anymore. They were hunting a shadow. They reached the spot where Jake had tracked the bikers earlier, and the group stopped to survey the area. Jake crouched down, examining the ground. The tracks were still fresh, and they led off into the dense brush. They're not far, Jake said, his voice steady. Stay sharp. The group followed him as he led them deeper into the hills, each step cautious, each movement calculated. The further they went, the more Jake could feel the weight of what they were walking into. The Ghost Riders weren't like any other gang. They didn't just want control of the land. They wanted everything. As they reached the top of a small ridge, Jake stopped. His eyes scanned the area in front of him, and then, in the distance, he saw it. A small camp, hidden in the trees, barely visible from the main trail. They're here, Jake whispered. He turned to the others. Get into position. We move in on my signal. The group nodded, taking up positions in the brush around the camp. Jake's hand rested lightly on his revolver as he crept forward, moving silently toward the camp. The closer they got, the more Jake could make out the shapes of the men sitting around the fire, their voices low, speaking in hushed tones. But something wasn't right. They were too relaxed, too unaware. Jake motioned for the others to stay put as he crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the camp, he could make out the faces of the men. They were older, battle-hardened, and their eyes flicked around, checking their surroundings. They knew how to survive, but Jake knew how to outsmart them. He waited for the right moment, and then, without warning, he moved. The sound of his revolvers echoed in the night, the sharp crack of gunfire followed by the shouts of surprise and confusion. The Ghost Riders scrambled to their feet, reaching for their weapons, but Jake and his men were already on top of them. The fight was quick, brutal. The Ghost Riders, caught off guard, tried to fight back, but they were no match for the people of Thunder Ridge. Jake's shots were precise, his movements swift. The men fell one by one, their weapons useless against the coordinated attack. The rest of the group retreated, running into the hills, but Jake wasn't about to let them escape. He gave chase, his legs pumping as he raced after them. The sounds of the retreating men echoed through the night, but Jake knew he had the advantage. These men didn't know the land like he did. They didn't know how to move in the hills. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Jake had tracked them down. He stood at the edge of a clearing, the Ghost Riders pinned in a small, isolated spot. They had nowhere to run, and now they were about to pay for what they had done. The leader of the Ghost Riders, a man with a cruel smile and cold eyes, stood in the center of the group. His eyes locked onto Jake's, and for a moment, there was silence. The two men studied each other, sizing each other up. "You think you've won?" The leader sneered. "You're just another bump in the road. We're not done here." Jake's revolver flashed in the early morning light, the sound of the shot ringing out as the leader collapsed to the ground. The rest of the Ghost Riders surrendered, their wills broken. "This town isn't yours," Jake said quietly, holstering his revolver. "Thunder Ridge belongs to the people who fought for it. And if you ever come back, I'll make sure you never leave." As the remaining Ghost Riders were tied up and taken back to Thunder Ridge, Jake felt the weight of what they had done. The battle had been won, but the war wasn't over. He knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time in a long while, Jake McCall felt a small sense of relief. The storm had passed for now, but Jake knew better than anyone. The West never stayed quiet for long. The days following the confrontation with the Ghost Riders were filled with quiet, uneasy relief. Jake McCall and the townsfolk had sent the outlaws fleeing, their leader taken down and the rest of their gang captured or driven off. Thunder Ridge was, once again, safe. But Jake knew better than anyone else that safety in the West was always temporary. The dust might settle for now, but it wouldn't stay still for long. Jake stood on the porch of his small cabin, watching the sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows over the town. Thunder Ridge, small and quiet, had always been a place of peace, a place that had never really asked for trouble, but trouble had found it. And Jake knew that as long as he was here, he would have to keep fighting for it. The townsfolk were still in the square, tending to the wounded, burying the bodies of those they had lost in the fight. Jake hadn't gotten much rest. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many unknowns. He'd done his best to prepare the town for what came next, but even he didn't know what that would be. The Ghost Riders weren't the only threat in the West. There were always more waiting to take advantage of any weakness. And Jake had seen enough to know that the peace they'd earned through blood and sweat could be ripped away in an instant. But for now, there was a brief quiet, a moment of respite. And Jake had to make the most of it. Betty came out of the diner, wiping her hands on a rag, her face tired but still determined. Her eyes met Jake's, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. She knew as well as Jake did that this was just a brief lull, a moment before the next storm. But for now, they had earned this peace. "You need to rest," Betty said, walking over to him. "You've been running on fumes for days." Jake gave a small, tired smile. "Can't rest just yet. There's still too much to do." Betty gave him a knowing look. "You've done everything you can. Thunder Ridge is standing, and it's because of you." Jake shook his head, a faint grimace on his face. "It's not enough. They're still out there, Betty. The Ghost Riders might have been a big piece, but there's something else behind them. Someone else. And they won't stop until they get what they want." Betty's face softened, but her expression remained firm. She had been with Jake through every battle, every struggle, and she wasn't one to back down when things got tough. "I know," she said quietly, "but for tonight, we've earned this. We can't keep living in the shadow of what's to come. We have to let the town breathe. Let the people know that they're safe." Jake looked over at the townsfolk, who were beginning to gather in small groups, talking, laughing, and celebrating their survival. The families, the ranchers, the farmers, all of them had been through hell and had come out on the other side. For once, the town was alive with hope. "You're right," Jake said, his voice quieter now. "But we can't forget what happened. We have to keep our eyes open. The next time, it could be worse." Betty stepped closer, resting a hand on Jake's shoulder. "And you'll be ready, just like you always are." Jake looked at her, his expression softening. There had been many times in his life when he had been alone, when the weight of the world had felt like it was on his shoulders. But not tonight. Tonight, he had the people of Thunder Ridge behind him. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for each other. And Jake knew that as long as they stood together, they would make it through whatever came next. "You know," Jake said, his voice almost a whisper, "I never wanted this. Never wanted to be the one everyone looked to for answers. But here we are." Betty smiled gently, her hand still resting on his arm. "Sometimes, Jake, the ones who don't ask for the weight of the world on their shoulders are the ones who can carry it." Jake looked out at the horizon, the fading sunlight casting a warm glow over the town. For the first time in days, he felt a small flicker of peace settle in his chest. The fight wasn't over. But for tonight, Thunder Ridge had won. And that was enough for him. The next morning, Jake gathered the townsfolk again in the town square. It was a crisp, clear day, the air still with the promise of autumn. The men and women stood in a loose circle, their eyes on Jake, waiting for him to speak. Jake knew that what he had to say would set the tone for what came next. The Ghost Riders were gone, but the battle had only just begun. "We've won the fight," Jake began, his voice steady, "but we haven't won the war. We all know that." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Jake could see the resolve in their faces, the determination to keep standing no matter what came next. "We've got a chance now," Jake continued, "but we can't get complacent. The Ghost Riders were just the beginning. There's someone else behind them, someone who wants control of this place. And we can't let them take it." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, making sure they understood. "We've got one shot at this. If we stand together, if we protect this town the way we've always protected each other, we can beat them." The townsfolk nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. They weren't just protecting their homes anymore. They were protecting their future. "We can't let fear control us," Jake said, his voice strong. "We fight for each other. We fight for Thunder Ridge." As he finished, the crowd erupted into a low cheer, their voices rising in unity. Jake's heart swelled with pride. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he believed that they could win it. Together. Later that night, Jake sat alone on the porch of his cabin, staring out at the town. The quiet, once so unfamiliar, now felt like a distant memory. Thunder Ridge had proven that it could stand firm in the face of any threat. But Jake knew that the storm was far from over. His hand rested on his revolver, the weight of it a constant reminder of the battles yet to come. But tonight, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. Tomorrow, the fight would begin again. But for now, Thunder Ridge was safe. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The days passed slowly in Thunder Ridge, but each day brought more preparations, more strategy. The Ghost Riders were still fresh in everyone's minds, and Jake McCall made sure the town stayed vigilant. He had spent years protecting this place, and now, more than ever, he could see the strength in the people who called this town home. Thunder Ridge was more than just a town to them. It was a legacy, a place built on hard work, grit, and perseverance. Jake had done his best to prepare them for what was coming. The danger wasn't just behind them. It was always just over the horizon. But for now, there was peace. For now, the town could breathe. Yet even as Jake stood in the square, overseeing the last of the fortifications being built, a feeling still gnawed at him. A sense that there was more to this story than they had uncovered. The Ghost Riders had been driven off, but their true purpose still eluded him. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that whoever had sent them wasn't done with Thunder Ridge. Not yet. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jake rode out to the north, his mind heavy with the thoughts of what the future held. The road was quiet, the dust settling behind him as the day's heat started to fade. The only sound was the rhythmic clip-clop of his horse's hooves, a steady beat that somehow comforted him, even in the midst of uncertainty. He reached the spot where the bikers had camped a few days before. The place was deserted now, the only evidence of the battle a few scorched patches of earth, a broken branch here and there. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry ground as he walked the perimeter. There was nothing here anymore, no sign of the men who had been so determined to take over. But Jake's instincts told him they weren't gone for good. He squatted down near the remains of the campfire and studied the ground. His eyes narrowed as he spotted something he hadn't seen before. A set of tracks, barely noticeable in the fading light. They were fresh, leading deeper into the woods. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Whoever was behind the bikers was still close. He wasn't just tracking the ghost riders anymore. He was tracking the source of their power. With a deep breath, Jake mounted his horse again and set off in pursuit of the tracks. The light was dimming fast, but he had spent enough time on these roads to know they weren't far from the truth. And tonight, Jake wasn't going to stop until he had answers. The trail led him further into the hills, the terrain growing rougher as the evening wore on. Jake's thoughts raced. The Ghost Riders had been just the beginning, but whoever had orchestrated this attack was someone far more dangerous, someone who had been operating in the shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were close, too close. As the last traces of daylight faded, Jake pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of a clearing. The moonlight was enough to illuminate the camp up ahead. A small, dimly lit fire burned at the center, the silhouettes of men moving in and out of the shadows. Jake's pulse quickened. This was it. He dismounted, his revolvers already in hand, and crept closer, staying low to the ground. He could hear voices now, muffled but distinct. They were speaking in low tones, but Jake had learned long ago how to read the cadence of a conversation. These men were talking about something important, something bigger than just an attack on Thunder Ridge. Jake listened intently, piecing together the fragments of their conversation. It was clear that the Ghost Riders were only the foot soldiers in a much larger operation. There was mention of territories, other towns, other groups, and a leader, a man who had been pulling strings from behind the scenes, organizing the chaos in the region. Jake's blood ran cold. Whoever this leader was, they were about to bring the full weight of their power down on Thunder Ridge. But Jake wasn't about to let that happen. He stood tall, stepping into the clearing. His boots thudded softly on the ground as he raised his revolvers, the moonlight catching the cold steel. "End of the line, boys," Jake said, his voice steady and calm. The men froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. But Jake was faster. The crack of gunfire echoed through the night, and one of the men dropped before he even had a chance to draw. The others scrambled, but Jake's aim was true. One by one, the men fell, each shot quick, efficient. The leader, who had been standing behind the fire, finally turned, his hand reaching for a hidden pistol. But Jake was already there. "You won't be needing that," Jake said coldly, his revolver aimed at the man's chest. "You and your gang have been a problem for too long. Now it's over." The man's eyes were filled with defiance, but there was fear there too. He knew Jake McCall. He had heard the stories. "You think you've won?" The leader spat, his voice hoarse. "You've just scratched the surface. There's more of us out there, and we're coming for your town. For everything." Jake didn't flinch. "I've heard that before. And I've sent men like you running every time." The leader's face twisted in rage, but before he could say another word, Jake fired. The man crumpled to the ground, his body falling lifeless at Jake's feet. Jake stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the fallen men around him. They were a part of something bigger, something more dangerous than he could have imagined. But Jake McCall wasn't the type of man to back down from a fight. He holstered his revolver and looked up at the stars, the quiet night settling back around him. This battle was over, but Jake knew it wasn't the end. The fight for Thunder Ridge was far from done. But as long as he was here, standing at the edge of his town, Jake McCall would never let it fall. The West had always been wild, but Thunder Ridge had a guardian, and Jake McCall was going to make sure it stayed that way. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.